Hi everyone, my name is Maxime Chouinard, and today we're going to be talking about the 1845 French Infantry Officer's Sabre. So in the last few videos I've been presenting you some antique swords from my collection, some of them I'm selling, and today we're going to be talking about this very popular, very long-lasting pattern that was made by the French Army in 1845, and this is the 1845 French Infantry Sabre. So this is as I was saying, a very popular, very long-lasting model of saber that was used from 1845 all the way to World War I in 1916, and some units of the National Guard in France still use this model today. Now, a little bit about background about this model of saber. So the one I'm holding here is a typical 1845. So it's got the leather scabbard, of course, and this one is a little bit different. It's got nickel-plated fittings. So normally they're just brass, but these ones have been nickel-plated for some reason, and it's got, of course, the full brass fittings on the guard, on the grip itself. So 1845 sabers are usually without a backstrap. So what I mean by the backstrap is the piece that comes behind here that you usually see on some of the British sabers. Most French sabers actually don't have a backstrap, which is an aspect that I do like because usually it gives you a better grip, I find, on the sword. Because a lot of these backstraps are usually smooth, so they're a little bit slippery. These sabers, as you can see, the grip is usually bound in wire. The grip is not wood, it is made with horn, and this makes for a very solid grip, of course. So the overall guard is brass, but it's a very solid construction. It's not really flimsy. It's got a one single branch, but it's a very, very thick branch. Not something that would bend easily. Same thing for the guard. Very thick guard, really. So although it is brass, it's not a fragile piece in any sense. So the blade of this saber is very unique, and this is what most of the sources would call a langue de cap, so a carp's tongue. And this is carp's tongue is usually a quillback or pipeback type of blade. So just as a comparison, I have here a pipeback British saber. As you can see, the pipe runs around the back and into the point of the blade, and it makes for a very flat blade usually. So in this case, I don't know how clearly you can see, but it's a little bit different, right? It doesn't have this typical quill. Actually, what happened with this sword, I think, is that, well, it was inspired by the 1838 pattern, which is a pattern that was made especially for the Chasseurs de Main-Seine, which is a light infantry regiment in the French army, and which has the full, way more typical pipeback, which was itself inspired by, we could say, some of the British sabers, but before that there was the 1816 French light cavalry saber, which had a pipeback just like the one I showed you, and which really was the first of its type in the French army. But anyway, coming back to the 1845, so I think, and there's unfortunately not a lot of documentation on this, and not a lot of people know what was the inspiration, who came up with this design. It's very common actually in the French sword collecting world, There's a lot of details about the shape of these blades, about their models, about some of the main production companies, but not a lot of history on their design really, and it's too bad. But anyway, I think what happened actually with this blade is that the pipe back usually have a mixed reputation. Some people love them, some people hate them. The reason is that it makes for a very stiff blade and sometimes an overly fragile blade. And I think what they wanted to do with the 1845 was to find some kind of a compromise between the more classical fuller blade and the pipe back. So what they came up with is a blade which has a fuller in the center here, but which also has some kind of a pipe back. So instead of having a pipe, they replaced the pipe by another fuller, which had a little bit of stiffness to the blade still. And this fuller ends about here and extends into a much more subtle pipe, as we just saw before. So not quite a pipe, more like again another secondary fuller on top here of the counterpoint. So it makes for a blade that's stiff. It's much stiffer than a lot of the blades I've got here, but not as much as some of the pipe backs, and it makes for a blade that is relatively light, but also packs some punch. I was very surprised actually. I started using the weapon dynamics computer that Vincent de Chevalier came up with. And I've been computing a lot of the antique swords that I bought, and I've been putting them on my website. If you want to peruse them, it's on isellswords.com. As far as I know, I'm the first guy selling sword, making these data public. And what I found is that this sword, the one I'm holding here, actually packs a lot of punch. So at the blade nose, so at where usually people would call the center of percussion, or the sweet spot, this blade has around 250 something grams at the sweet spot. So ideally would have all these grams when it's to hit with. And it's got a very good overall balance, agility in the point as well as in the hilt, as you'll see here in the data. So I've copied here the schematics that the computer is giving me. And compared to the other blades, it's actually really, really good. As far as the weight at the percussion point, it's way higher than the 1845 54 I got here, way higher than my Warwickshire regiment sword. It's actually in the same range as my 1796, which I think tells a lot, and it's it's got way less, of course, inertia at the point and at the hilt, so it would make a really good cutter. And I've heard comment. I haven't had a chance to cut with an antique like this one, although I very much hope to do it. But I've heard some good comments about people who tried, saying that these swords are really good cutters, as well as good thrusters, because they get a good point agility to them, and the blade is not extremely curved, so it still manages to give point quite easily. And it's reflected into its use as a military sword. So I haven't been able to find a lot of comments from the time period of its use by soldiers or officers that use this blade. So it was used by the NCOs, but also by common officers, up until the superior officers rank. Superior officers also use a type they call the 1845, but it actually has a blade much straighter blade, and the blade is actually much more like the earlier cuirassier swords that were used in the Napoleonic times, and it's a little bit longer than this one. So why did they wanted a different type of blades for superior officers? Again, it's not very clear, but my own hypothesis is that superior officers are probably more gonna be on a horse a lot of the time. So you need to have a sword which is going to be useful on a horse, and I guess they considered that having a cuirassier kind of sword, a little bit longer, would be of more help in those situations, both on foot and on horse. But anyway, coming back to the more regular officer sword, I've got two models actually. This one, which was made in the mid 19th century in Klangenthal by Kudo, very popular company at the time, which used to be the official company of the official contractor of the French government for most of their swords. But at that time period, I think they had started to become a more of a privately owned company, so they would make private swords for officers. And the guard is stamped with AB, which is kind of mysterious inscriptions. I haven't found anyone who can tell me who was the company, but apparently every hilt and every sword that has this stamp is a very high quality blade. So good sign for this one. It's got a very interesting logo actually. I'll post a picture here, but it's AB, and both letters are separated by a I'm not sure what the name is for this dagger, unfortunately, but a kind of Middle Eastern type of dagger. So interesting logo. The second one I'm holding here is also a French saber, of course, but it's actually made in Solingen in 1868. So just before the Franco-Prussian War. So this was probably used as part of the Franco-Prussian War, actually. And this sword is much lighter than the other one I showed you. It packs less punch, but of course got a little bit more agility to it. But it still has a lot of punch. Compared again to the other type of blades I just showed you, it would be a very, very good cutter for a one-handed saber. And these blades are usually shorter than British sabers by a few inches. But I think that what they sacrifice in length, they made for in cutting power. Also, this model sword was the model for the American 1850 foot officer saber. What is very interesting about this model is that it was used. They used the exact guard of the 1845, but for the blade they went to some very interesting combination. So the blade is essentially a mix between an 1821 saber, French saber, and an 1845 British saber. So it's got the overall look of an 1845 British, except for the ricochet, which is usually a little bit shorter, but it has a Montmorency type blade. So Montmorency type blade is, you'll see it on the pictures, but what it usually means is that it's got this fuller at the back of the blade, just in the middle. So it reinforces the middle of the blade, which is usually where a lot of the shock happens. It's a type of blade that was created in the 18th century by a specific regiment under the orders of the Duke of Montmorency, and it became very popular and was used until then by the French army and many other countries, obviously, and was reused on the 1822 cavalry sabers and the American version as well. So, another difference with the American version, American sabers usually have a ray skin, or actually shark skin, wooden grip, wooden grip covered with shark skin, whereas French sabers just have a horn grip. So the pattern was used until 1855, when it was replaced by the 1855 pattern, of course. The biggest difference is the scabbard. This is actually the only real difference. I'm not sure why they bothered changing the name of the pattern for this, but they switched from a leather scabbard to a steel scabbard. So, only difference. What is very great about the French saber, French weapons, starting up like age, is that usually on the back of the blade you'll find the name of the maker, but also the date it was made and the pattern it was, and so for which type of officer it was meant to be used. So if it was for an NCO, you'll have an indication there. So NCOs and officer sabers are fairly hard to differentiate, other than officer saber are usually better quality because they're privately purchased, but not always. So some officers could buy very cheap sabers if they want to do. But usually the guard are a little bit more detailed, as is the case with these ones. So this is most probably an NCO saber, and it's got a little bit less quality to its whole assembly, but honestly it would be very hard to tell all these apart if you didn't know what you look for. So the 1845 saber was used in 1855. Pattern were used up until 1882, and even beyond. Actually, in 1882, the French army introduced a new pattern, which was basically a spadroon type of sword, which had a very bad reputation with the French officers. A lot of French officers actually kept the 1845 pattern, as apparently was a possibility, and a lot of them actually, mostly NCO officers, carried them in World War I. From 1914 to 1916, the NCOs, the adjutant sergeants, still carried the 1845 or 1855, sometimes in the field, and you have pictures actually of these officers carrying the swords in trenches. So I unfortunately don't have many, or I don't think I've found any to date mentions of their use in the field, but in 1916 they were phased out of the NCO's equipment. So of course swords were not necessarily a major weapon anymore as far as infantry was concerned for trench warfare. That's about it for my video today. This 1845 saber, by the way, is for sale on my website, isellswords.com, if you're interested in having it. And otherwise, I do run across these swords fairly often, so do check my website if you're looking for a saber like this one. Very nice saber, which is great for if you're doing HEMA for solo training, and if you're looking for a practice sword of any kind, I couldn't recommend more going with antique sabers, as long as you're not using them for sparring or drilling with a partner. If you want to use these swords for solo training, as long as they're in good general shape, they are great. They will make much better trainers than any replica you can get today. So I hope you liked my video. If you did, please subscribe, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comment below, and I'll see you next time.